The cave breathed like a living thing, slow and cold, exhaling mist along the water that crept over black stone and froze at the lip. Jon pressed his palm to the rock, feeling how old it was, older than Winterfell, older than the wall, the chill sinking through the glove into his hand. Behind him, the soft scritch of flint on steel sparked light, and Ygritte coaxed a curl of flame into being with the patience of a shepherd calling lambs. The fire took, and the cave gathered it close, the glow spilling over damp walls veined with ice, over furs piled in a tumble, over Ygritte's freckles dusted like fox tracks across snow. Ghost lay not far off, a white shadow sprawled, red eyes half-lidded, untroubled by the water's voice or the storm muttering outside. "Come away from that," Ygritte said without looking back. "You'll freeze your hand to it for a jest." Jon pushed back his hood. Snow had clumped in his hair and dampened the wool. He shook it loose and stood there foolishly a moment, as he had the first time he'd seen her in a light that did not belong to sun or moon. The fire filled her hair and painted her bare arms with color stolen from summer. She lifted her face, and for an instant he forgot stone, and vows, and the long white spine of the wall. She looked like home. "I won't go back," he said. It was the first time he'd given the thought a voice. It weighed different on the tongue than it had in his skull. He expected the cave to protest, the old rock to shudder, his father's shade to step from the shadows with grave eyes and the measured words of a man who kept faith exactly. Ygritte set the twig she'd been using as a torch aside, then tossed him a glance so swift and bright it could have been a blade. "I? Then say it again, Crow." "I won't go back." She straightened, and the humor in her face softened. "Good." She nodded, as if he'd finally spoken the word she'd been waiting for at the end of a song. She rose and crossed to him, her boots quiet on the stone. "You could have told me in the wind on the climb. You could have told me at the top, or when your hands were white as bone and mine were warming them. But here's fine. The cave will keep it." "It's not only for you," Jon said, the words tripping, unwilling. "The dead are walking and the fist is lost. The old men at the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch don't know it yet. But winter's come creeping and it has teeth. I swore vows to the Watch and I meant them, but what are vows worth if they blind you? There's a war coming none of us are ready for. Mance knows it. He means to go south to save his people. He'll go whether I go or no." He took her hand, calloused fingers rough as any rangers he'd known, and held them as if hands could sew a torn world. "I'll be no more use on a crumbling wall than on a shattered shield. If I can do more good with you, with us," Ygritte corrected. "Say it true. With you and yours," Jon said, and made himself meet her eyes. "With the free folk, and with the North." Ygritte's mouth quirked. "There's the rub. You're a man that has two skies and two snows, kneelers and free folk both. Your father with his talking weirwood and his gods in a box, and your mother." She broke off, the way she always did when she reached the edge of what he did not know. "Your wolf knows where you belong. He came when you called him. Ghost is free. He still came." Jon glanced over at the direwolf, who had lifted his head and was watching them as if judgment were a deer to be brought to ground and shared between them all. "He came," Jon said. Ygritte tapped his chest where his cloak crossed, fingers drumming a beat he'd felt in her ribs when winter wind had driven them together. "So, you told the cave. Will you tell the king?" "Mance will laugh," Jon said, thinking of the singer's quick, long hands and the way laughter darted to the corners of his mouth even when he was speaking of hunger and dead children. "But he'll listen, and Tormund will roar and clap you on the back until you choke, and Rattleshirt will clack his bones and call you a crow until he tires of the taste." Ygritte's eyes shone with mischief that hid nothing. "We'll tell them all, but tell me first and tell me straight. If you won't go back to your wall, where will you go? Where does that wolf nose point?" Jon had not known that answer until he spoke it. "South," he said, surprising himself, but not as a raider slinking through the trees with his face smeared in ash. "To the North Zone, to the Umbers in their cold tower and the Mormonts on their island, to the Littles and the Norreys and the Wools, to every hearth with a stark tail hanging over it like a shield. They won't open their doors to Mance Raider's host. They would to a Stark. You're no Stark, Ygritte said gently, no malice in it. Only the practical tongue of a spear wife who measured truths by whether they cut meat. You wear the name the crows gave you. I have my father's blood, Jon said, and for an instant he heard Lady Catelyn's silence in the words as if it were a sound. I was raised in his hall under his gods. I know their names like I know the names of the stones in the yard. I can open doors they cannot. Ygritte studied him, head cocked like a bird listening beneath snow for water. Aye, and if a door opens, what pours through it? Us. With our mammoths that bang their heads on gate lintels and our giants that don't fit in your soft chairs? Our boys who don't know a curtsy? Our girls who don't know to lower their eyes? Our lads that steal sheep because they're hungry and because they can? She grinned. Our songs they don't know? All of it, Jon said, but not as raiders, as kin. He drew breath. There it was, whole for the first time. He tasted fear. He tasted relief. I mean to bind the North and the free folk with a marriage. Ygritte arched an eyebrow. Do you? And to whom would you hitch? There's Val and Dalla if you want pretty girls with pretty hands, and 100 spearwives who'd take you to see if you can keep up. But I'll break their noses one by one. You know I will. To you, Jon said. His throat went dry and the cave listened. To you if you'll have me. Ygritte blinked. For a heartbeat, he saw a girl startled on a hillside when a snow fox leaps. Then the laugh broke and she shoved him with both hands, light but fierce, the joy of it rasping his heart raw. You great stupid crow, she said, laughing and angry all at once. Did you think I'd lead you into my cave to practice your vows on the echoes and not have thought of this before you? I'll have you. I had you at the bottom of the wall when you were shaking with the cold, and I had you in the storm, and I had you when you told me you'd go and I said you wouldn't. I'll have you when you're a gray crow with your hair white as ghost. He held her then, the fire stinging his cheeks, the scent of wood smoke and wet wool and the faintest trace of pine resin in her hair. Fear unhooked in his chest. The world remained vast and white and hungering, but his place in it narrowed to a warmth 2 hands could measure. When they left the cave in the morning, the wind had scoured the sky to a hard blue. The mountains crouched like sleeping bears. The climb down was treacherous, black ice masked with a dusting of new snow. Jon went first, driving his iron spikes into rock that had held giants and worse. He tested each hold, then waved Ygritte down. She came like the wind itself, sure-footed and laughing when the flurries blew her hair across her eyes. They moved in a rhythm they'd learned together, passing rope and iron and trust. By the time they reached the broken shelf where the path turned and the world opened, the sun had already begun its pale slide. Below them, in the wide fold of the valley, Mance Raider's camp squatted like a city of tattered stars. Smoke climbed in gray sheets, tents huddled around great central fires. The mammoths stood to their shaggy knees in drifts, steam ghosting their trunks as they huffed. Giants moved slow and deliberate, shapes too large to be properly believed. A boy raced on a shaggy Garen, his hair a black line against the snow. Somewhere a bone flute piped a song so old the notes felt like frost. They descended into noise. The barking of dogs, the cough of an old woman, the swear of a man striking flint, laughter that spilled bright and unafraid. Ghost slunk at Jon's heel, bristling when a dog ventured too close, barely deigning to glance at the mammoth that swung its tusks with mild curiosity. Ygritte stalked at Jon's side like a victory claimed and held. They found Tormund Giant's bane by the fire that seemed always his beard a brindled pelt full of breadcrumbs and ice, his great hands wrapped around a horn that smelled of mead and goat. Tormund stood when he saw them, his laugh booming out as if he'd coaxed it from the belly of a mountain. Well, there we are, all of us, Tormund said, sweeping an arm that could have felled a small pine. Crows fly south for winter, I always said it, and here's one with his feathers all rubbed off and a spearwife's teeth marks on his throat. I can put teeth there if there's none, Ygritte said, and she bared them in a grin that made the men nearest them shuffle aside and look elsewhere. Tormund clapped Jon's shoulder so hard he bit his tongue. What say you then, boy? Back to your brothers with a good store of tales and a bundle of my kisses? Or have you found your head and decided to stand where the world is?" "I'm staying," Jon said. It was easier this time. "And I have words for Mance if he'll hear them." Tormund's eyes, bright as embers, flicked to Ygritte and back. "Oh, he'll hear. He'd hear a snowflake if it told him something he hadn't heard before." He set his horn down and jerked his head. "Come, then. Best to catch him before the singer's drunk and starts telling stories about how he stole the Dark's own cloak off a dead boy's back." Mance's tent was larger than most, but it was no king's pavilion with silk and gilt. The hides that made it had come off beasts that had roamed a world that hated men. Inside, warmth and the smell of stew met them. Dallas sat on a pile of furs, her belly round, her hair braided with small bones polished smooth as river stones. Her eyes were clear. Val, her sister, sharp as a cold bite, stood beside her, tending a pot. Rattleshirt leaned near the entrance, piling bones on a thong like a child with shells. Varamir Sixskins dozed against a rolled tent wall, his face the face of a man who went hunting in other than his own flesh. Mance Rayder looked up from a map scratched on hide with soot and oil. He smiled that small, quick smile of his. "Jon Snow," he said easily, as if Jon had come back from fetching wood. "Have you eaten?" "I've seen men try to speak with empty bellies and the words rattle out like dice." "I've eaten," Jon said. He took off his gloves and put them in his belt, and only then realized his hands were shaking. Ygritte's elbow nudged his ribs. He drew a breath. "I've come to ask your leave to marry Ygritte." Silence shifted a beat. Rattleshirt snorted, but Dalla's mouth curved, and Val's eyes went to Ygritte with an expression Jon could not read entirely. Mance's smile broadened like a fire stirred. "That sounds like her leave to give, not mine," he said. "But you have it from me if you need it, and from the free folk if you want it. We take what we want, but we give leave for joy when it comes." "I want more than that," Jon said. His heart thudded. He imagined if he put his hand out, the notes of his life would hover there like frost and melt. "I would bind the free folk to the north. The dead move. The wall will not hold if we stand on one side of it and they stand on the other, waiting to be devoured. You know this. We can raid and die by the hundreds and the thousands, or we can live. There are men in the north who would stand with you if they trusted you. They will not trust a raider. They will trust a Stark." Mance leaned back on his hands, eyes half-lidded, thoughtful. "And you mean to be their Stark?" "I mean to go as my father's son," Jon said. The words were simpler when he put them that way. "I'm no lord. I don't ask for crowns or cloaks. I ask for guest right and hearths open to people I call my own." Rattleshirt rattled his bones and cackled. "He means to walk into Winterfell and ask for their soup pot." "Shut your jaw," Tormund growled without heat. Val dipped a ladle and poured stew into a wooden bowl, handed it to Jon as if he were a boy who had stumbled through her door with snow in his eyelashes. "You speak like a kneeler when you say trust," she said. "Tell a Norey you trust him and he'll ask what you want to steal. Tell a Wool and he'll ask who you want him to fight. Tell a spearwife and she'll ask what meat you're offering. Words are air. Offer meat." "I've meat," Jon said quietly. He set the bowl aside untasted, reached to the sash at his waist, and drew out the small roll of oiled leather he'd had near his skin since long before the climb. He unrolled it on the hide map. Obsidian gleamed, black blades full of their own night. Daggers napped to wicked edges, arrowheads like tears, a spear point that drank the light and did not give it back. Val's breath hissed between her teeth. Rattleshirt's hand twitched toward a blade and stopped, his greed caged by fear he could not name. Dalla put her hand to her belly. Varamir's eyes slit and opened wholly, as if a beast had scented blood. "I found these at the fist of the first men," Jon said, "buried with an old horn under a cairn's stones. We cut one of the others at the fist with one like these." It screamed. Memory surged cold as the wind that had screamed that night. Steel shatters on them. Fire slows them. These kill them. There are more to be had if we go south to Dragonstone and ask Stannis Baratheon to break his rock open. But until then we have these, and we can make more if we find the right stone. If we ask the right men. if we work with them, not against them." Mance looked at the blades as if they were a song he'd not heard and had been waiting for all the same. He tapped one with a finger. "You've brought meat," he conceded, "and a sharp knife to cut it." "Give me a company," Jon said. He felt the path under his feet as he spoke it. "Tormund, if he'll come. Ygritte, a handful of the frozen shore men who know the sea. 2 or 3 of your best archers. A giant if one will come to lift gates and shake men's courage out of them. We'll go along the shore to Bear Island. The Mormonts are hard as iron in winter, and they hate the Ironborn with a good fat hate. If we push the Ironmen back at Deepwood Motte, if we free the green boys stolen for their oars, if we keep guest right and do not steal a thing that is not freely given, the Mormonts will listen. The mountain clans will listen to the Mormonts, and Wyman Manderley may listen to them all if he hears what they have seen." He caught Mance's gaze and held it. "Let us go south not to raid, but to deliver a gift and a warning. Let us bring back men, oaths, and bread. And if you bring back a rope and a broken neck?" Rattleshirt asked, hungry. "Then the wind will have fewer bones to rattle," Ygritte said sweetly. "And you'll have to steal more." Tormund laughed. Dalla smiled fully. Not the half-smile of a woman taking the measure of a thing, but the warm curve of a woman measuring good news against bad and choosing to lift her chin. "I can think of worse gifts than a winter island and a song of the dead," she said. "And worse messengers. It suits you, Snow, to carry meat instead of heartbreak." Mance was quiet. The tense hide walls bellied inward when the wind struck them. The stew bubbled. Somewhere outside, a child's shriek turned to giggles as a dog nosed him. Mance's eyes were not laughing now. They were the eyes of a man who had weighed 100 roads and walked each with his mind. "You see further than most men your age," he said at last. "You see a way. I'll see if I can make men follow it." He stood. "Tormund, you'll go with him?" Tormund shrugged as if Mance had asked him if he'd eat bread when he was starving. "I'll go. I've a fancy to kick an Iron Man down his own hall. And I want to see a Mormont woman glare at me. I've heard it's better than mead." "Val?" Mance asked. Val's chin went up. "I'll not have Dalla near your iron men," she said. "But I can send 5 spearwives I'd as soon not face on a dark path. And a boy with eyes like a cat's to watch the shore, and a girl who hears owls in their heads. You like your Neeler ravens. We have birds of our own. Take Jarl," Mance said to Jon. "He climbs like smoke and sees paths where other men see walls. And Styr will lend you 6 thens. They'll keep a line. The rest you choose as you will. But hear me, Snow. If you come to a hall, you keep your hands open and your blade shirt unless the hall breaks guest right first. The first free folk that steals a loaf when you walk south will answer to me when you come north again." "I'll answer to you now," Jon said. "If a man of mine does that, I'll take the hand he used." Mance nodded. "Make the Neelers see that, and they'll hear the rest of your words." He looked at Ygritte. "And you, Red Girl, do you go?" Ygritte tilted her head. "That's no question for a man to ask," she said. "He can ask if I'll carry the other end of the log if he likes. But I've said yes." Mance's smile came and went like a bird alighting. "Then go," he said, "and come back with a winter's worth of bread and a summer's worth of songs." They left on a pale noon when the cold burned as clean as a blade. Tormund led with his laugh, Jarl ghosting along the ridges. 3 men from the frozen shore with seal leather cloaks and eyes that had learned the sea. 3 thens who moved as one, spears heavy and bronze gleaming dull, and 5 spearwives who treated Jon like a useful log. Val's owlgirl kept to the higher tracks, quiet as a shadow, her head cocked to listen to things that made the hair on Jon's neck prickle. Ghost ranged ahead, a spill of white against white, reacting to scents none of the others caught. The land sagged and lifted, ancient as sorrow. They slept in snow caves when the wind found them, under fir branches when it did not, and sometimes in abandoned crofters' huts with roofs that had decided to be floors and smoke holes that tried to be windows. They ate dry meat and hard bread and sometimes fresh seal, and once Ygritte shot a ptarmigan and laughed to see the bird turn white in her hands as its blood steamed. The days shortened with the certainty of a blade being drawn. The nights filled with stars hard and innumerable as thrown salt. Twice they found the dead walking. The first time was near a half-frozen stream where hard reeds whispered to themselves. The white had been a trapper once, his bones showing through rents in his furs where something had taken bites. His eyes were blue and shallow as sky water. He moved without breath. Tormund had him down with a swing of his axe that would have felled a poplar, but the thing clawed at the snow and tried to pull itself hand over hand. A then took its head with neat economy. The thing still twitched. Jon lit a torch and touched it to the body and watched the fire take. Slow at first, reluctant as if the cold wanted to keep this debt for itself. The second time was uglier. It was night and wind, and Val's owlgirl cocked her head fast as a whip and whispered, "They're here." They came out of the trees without sound. 3 men and something that had not been a man, low and almost limping. The thens formed a wall. The spearwives stepped forward with a scream that would have curdled them. Eek! Jon had an obsidian arrow knocked, his fingers steady on the string. He loosed. The arrow took the limping thing in the shoulder and it turned its head without haste. Its eyes were a deeper blue than the others had been, and Jon felt his breath stick. Then Ygritte's arrow took the thing through the throat and it staggered, and Tormund smashed it with his axe and it came apart like firewood. After, Ygritte leaned against him and laughed too loud, then cried a little where no one could see but him. By the time they came down to the frozen shore, the wind had a different shape, full of salt and old stories. The waves shouldered against the ice as if trying to shove winter aside to reclaim the pebbled beach. The free folk there built their shelters to hunker down and ride storms, and their boats were tough and ugly as walruses. The man who held them watched with a single pale eye and a face like driftwood. He listened to Tormund's talk of Iron Men and Mormonts and shrugged as if he'd weather a worse blow. "You want boats," he said. "You want to go to an island full of women who'd as soon knock your teeth out as kiss you, to fight men who'll slit your throat while they're smiling. You've meat." His pale eye went to the bundle Jarl carried across his back, and when Jon opened it and the obsidian glinted, he breathed once. Deep. "Aye," he said. "I'll lend you 5 boats and men to pull them. You bring those blades back with you sure as your teeth, and you bring back tales that make winter warm in telling." They launched at dawn when the sea clenched itself against the land and tried to pull it away. The boats rode like corks, lifted and dropped. Their sealskin seams creaking. Ghost crouched in the prow of Jon's boat as if he'd invented the sea. Ygritte pulled an oar with a face of bravado until her shoulders burned and she began to swear in a style all her own. Half the words from the frozen rivers, half from the hearth. Tormund sang something so rude it made even the frozen shore men grin. The thens rode without sound, and their breath smoked like the seas. Jarl watched the water like a hunter who had learned another kind of track. Bear Island rose like a hulking shadow, pines crowding the shore, a winter beast that had decided to sleep in a long shape. They came in on the lee of a small headland, and it was as if the island had grown eyes while they approached. For by the time the first keel scraped pebbles, 2 lines of women stood waiting above the tide, bows in hand, axes at hips, hair bound back or braided close, faces that did not ask for permission to exist. The first among them had a scar that crossed her cheek like a river changed its mind. She watched the boats with a look that would have grounded eagles. Tormund raised his hands. "Halloo, ladies!" he boomed, and Jon wanted to kick him, but there was too much of Tormund to kick. "We've come to speak of Iron Men weeping and of guests that don't steal spoons. We'll have few spoons left if guests come as they have before," the scarred woman said. Her voice carried. "You've brought giants?" She squinted. "No, only a big man with a bigger voice, and a boy with a wolf that thinks he's a lord." "Sometimes the wolf is the lord," Ygritte said, mild. She slung her yew bow over one shoulder. "We'd be speaking with Mormont blood if there's any to meet us." The scarred woman exchanged a glance with a younger woman whose jaw looked as if it had been cut from mountain. "You'll speak with Alysanne Mormont," she said at last. "That's me. Put down your toys and walk with empty hands or we'll fill you with new holes. And tell your wolf if he touches a child, I'll cut his tail off to make a leash." Ghost showed all his teeth. Jon touched his neck and the dire wolf stilled like a snowdrift when the wind stops, still full of potential motion. "I am Jon Snow of Winterfell," he called. and the heads lifted at the name the way birds lift when a hawk lines the horizon. I am Eddard Stark's son. He drew breath and let the next words fall like coins on a table. This is Ygritte of the Free Folk, who will be my wife if you and your gods allow. We come to offer you meat, and to ask your help making more. They brought them up from the shore to a hall that smelled of smoke and fish and old laughter, with a hearth that had learned to be the heart of a thing. Trophies hung on the walls that were not Kneeler's trophies. A spear that had taken a walrus in its black eye. A cloak made from a white bear's skin that had to have been a story before it was a garment. The child at the end of the long bench could not be more than 8, small and fierce, with hair like moss and eyes that regarded Jon as if measuring him for a hole to be dug if he came up short. Alysanne Mormont stood before the hearth and crossed her arms over her chest. "Speak," she said, "and speak quick before my patience freezes." Jon set the bundle of obsidian on the long table and unrolled it. The room leaned forward as if the table had been tilted. He told them of the dead at the fist, of blue eyes in the night, of how steel shattered and fire slowed and dragonglass killed. He told them of Mance's host and what it was doing here in truth, not because the free folk had woken one day and decided to nip their neighbors like foxes gone bad, but because there was something old and malign moving in woods that used to be only cruel. He told them they meant to go to Deepwood Motte and pull the Iron Men down from the place they had taken. He told them he meant to keep Guest right like a law carved into bone, and what he would do to any man of his who forgot that law. He told them he was Ned Stark's son, and that his father had taught him the sentence and the swing belonged to the same hand. When he finished, the child at the end of the bench piped, "Are you a bastard?" Jon bowed his head, only the smallest next. "Yes, my lady." The child, Lyanna Mormont, Alysanne named her later, a girlish echo of a long-ago name, sniffed. "Then you're half as good and twice as much trouble. Prove the first and we'll forgive the second." Alysanne's scar twitched when she smiled, and the hall's cold seemed to ease. "We've bled for Starks," she said. "We've died for them. We've watched them go south and not come back. The Iron Men took Deepwood, and we went to take it back with what men we had and lost 2 daughters for our trouble. If you can show me the Iron Men weeping, I'll listen to your songs about dead things. If you break Guest right, I'll plant your head in the snow and call it a warning. And if you marry that pretty fox there, I'll give her a pelt and a knife and expect you to sit in the high seat without telling her to sit in the low one." Ygritte grinned toothily. "I like your island," she said. They struck that night in a snow that came with a hiss like a secret. Deepwood Motte was a timber hall and a timber wall, strong enough to turn wild bands and wolf packs, not strong enough to turn men with giants and a mind to break. Jon had thought to regret not having a giant along until he realized what he had instead. Then discipline and Tormund's fearless humor, Jarl's eyes that made the world bare a last secret, and Mormont women with axes in their hands and grief in their bones. They went up the ditch and over the pointed stakes like men climbing the ribs of an old god, silent until the moment silence died. It was ugly as all true fights were. Iron Men were slippery and cruel. They liked hooks. Tormund took a hook in the shoulder and broke the man's wrist bracing it, then head-butted him until Jon thought the Iron Man's face would come off. Ygritte's arrows found gaps in the Iron Man's sea-wolf armor as if she'd made the gaps. A then died with the quiet astonishment of a man who had done well and cannot believe there is no more doing to be had. Jarl got atop the wall and tossed down a rope, and 2 men who climbed that rope afterward swore no man climbed like that unless the air had hands. Jon saw Ghost go low and silent through the gatehouse, saw men look down and realize their guts were open, and die with their eyes still questioning. When it was done, the long house stank of smoke and fear. The Iron Men threw down their axes and spat men's names that did not matter here. Alysanne Mormont took the surrender with the economy of a housewife reckoning bread. She looked at Jon and lifted her chin a fraction. "Guessed right," she said. Jon's mouth was bitter with iron. His hands burned from a spear haft. His chest ached where a shield had not quite stopped to blow. He went to the hearth in the longhouse, threw kindling on the coals, and coaxed a flame. He broke bread. He broke it evenly. He salted it carefully. He looked at the Iron Men with eyes that did not blink and held the bread out. And when each man took his piece, Jon watched the bite taken, watched the throat swallow. He drank the ale out loud, a gulp so the whole house heard the wet sound. Then he looked at the free folk who had come down with him, at Tormund with blood dried in his beard and Ygritte with her hair blown back and a slash on her cheek that would be a story, and he said, "Anyone breaks guest right in this hall, he'll be a ghost before morning. And I don't mean my wolf." After, in the press of bodies and steam rising off cloaks and meat, Alysanne came to him with a square of cloth and a thread and needle blunt as truth. She stitched the split on his forearm without asking, the thread biting through skin like reminding him to be careful with what he carried. "You did what you said," she said. "That's more than most men do. Now listen to a woman with a house full of daughters. You've won yourself trouble. You bring free folk south and the old men in their long coats will wet themselves and call it snow. They'll call you Oathbreaker. They'll say you want Winterfell." "I don't," Jon said, and the ache of not wanting it and wanting it anyway swelled like the sea under ice. "I want it kept." "Wise," Alysanne said dryly. "We're low on those as well as bread." She wiped the needle on her skirt and stuck it into the cloth. "You'll want to speak with Wool and Burley and Norrie. They don't hold with Iron Men and they don't hold with Boltons. The Red Wedding has the North howling into its hands. Bring them something to set their howl to. Bring them a Stark." She looked at Ygritte across the hall where the spearwife stood in a ring of Mormont girls, showing them how to grip a bow and not get their arms skinned by the string. Or bring them a story good enough to make them forget they wanted a different one. They sent ravens. They sent runners. They sent the owl girl to stand in a tree until the snow made a crown on her head and listen for wings softer than regret. They brought in the mountain clans in ones and twos, lords by courtesy and dignity, not by papers and seals. Norrie came lean as a whip, and Wool came with fists like stones and a daughter who laughed like a brook. Burley had a nose like a hawk's and a limp like a story he did not tell. They listened and did not smile and did not interrupt. Jon showed them the obsidian. Then let one of them hold a spear without putting his weight on it. Tormund drank with Wool until the table cried mercy. When Jon finished telling, Wool folded his hands like stones coming to rest. "You're the wolf's get," he said. "I saw you in Winterfell when my beard was less gray. You had a look like you'd bite the sun if it didn't come up when you asked." He frowned. "You've a kneeler's words and a free man's eyes. That's a trouble. It's also a thing to be used." Burley scratched his nose. "The Boltons wear the South like a cloak stolen off a corpse. The Freys dribble after them with their knives. The Manderley watches and counts. The Karstarks are a mess of old quarrels." He shrugged. "If I saw a Stark, I'd follow him to see if he remembered the way home." Norrie's voice was a dry wind. "You're not a Stark that any lawman would swallow," he said. "But the North's law's been kicked in the ditch and pissed on all the same. What I want to know is if you can hold a line when the dead come and if your free folk will stop at a door when the meat's behind it." "They will," Jon said. "I will make them. And when the dead come, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder or we'll fall alone, 6 times faster." Wool grunted. "Good. I like men who notice they'll die." They set the wedding under the weirwoods of Bear Island in a ring of trees that clutched snow like the skirts of women caught in a gale. The heart tree's face was old and kind, or old and indifferent. Jon had never quite known which. He stood before it with Ygritte while Alysanne Mormont bound their wrists with a strip of leather cut from a belt that had gone around Mormont waists for 4 generations. The island's wind threaded through the ceremony, teasing hair, lifting the ends of the leather so they fluttered like pennants too small to matter to any but those whose hands they bound. Jon looked at Ygritte and saw fear and laughter and hunger and the stubborn joy of a woman who had decided to live and to make a world for her living. And he felt the old gods like a presence that was the absence of all voices but his own. "Do you take this man and his wolf and his trouble?" Alysanne asked, formal yet amused. "I take him," Ygritte said, "and I'll unmake him if he deserves it." "Do you take this woman and her bow and her tongue?" Alysanne asked. "I take her," Jon said, "and I'll unstring the bow and kiss the tongue when either is too sharp." Alysanne snorted her approval. "Good. If either of you breaks guest right under my roof, I'll unmake you both. Kiss and be done." They kissed, and the cheering that broke blew off the snow clinging to the branches, and the flakes drifted in shining scraps as if the sky had tossed its wedding veil. Tormund wept and wiped his tears on his beard and insisted it was the wind. Val's smile was uncharacteristically soft. Dalla lifted her hand and the child within her shifted like a small secret. Lyanna Mormont rolled her eyes and laughed anyway. Ghost sat down, then lay, and thumped his tail on the snow, slow, thoughtful, satisfied. They made their way back to Deepwood, and then pushed on toward the Wolfswood, bringing with them the taste of courage and the smell of smoke and salt. They did not raid. They paid for what they took. They left more than they found in places where hunger had been carving men into smaller men. An old crofter wept at the loaf left behind. A boy with a limp followed the column to its edge and then back to his mother because his mother called, and Ygritte watched with a face that was a lesson and a wound. Ghost took a liking to a girl who threw him bones that no one else wanted. The girl laughed like bells when the direwolf caught them. When word came of the red wedding, it came like a wind that had blown over graves and brought the smell with it. It came in the voice of a peddler half-frozen, mumbling the names as if he'd forgotten they were names and thought they were stones. Robb Stark, Catelyn Tully, the great Jon in chains, Dacy Mormont dead, Meege lost, men cut down in a hall that had pretended to be safe. Jon felt the world tilt under his feet again the way it had tilted at the top of the wall. He went into the trees and was sick where Ghost would not see him. When he came back, his face was made of something solid and cold. Ygritte touched the corner of his mouth with one finger and did not say he looked like Ned Stark and did not say he did not, because both would have been true and both would have broken him. "We go on," she said. "We go harder." They did. The North was a wounded thing, but wounded things fight with a purity uninjured ones do not know. The Manderleys sent word to Bear Island. "Come to White Harbor with a tale worth hearing, and I'll feed you while I listen." The letter had a greasy thumbprint on it, and the words had been written with a careful hand that had not been careful its whole life. Jon took it and tasted the meaning in it the way men tasted snow to know if it was dirty. They went to White Harbor by the quickest safe way, hugging the forest, crossing rivers at known fords, always careful to be seen when they wanted to be seen and not at other times. The city rose white and stubborn on its river's mouth, fat and practical, with walls like loaves that had cracked in a hot oven, towers like candles, ships riding in the harbor like knives ready to come out of their sheaths. Wyman Manderley received them in a hall that smelled of roasted fish and better days. "So," he said, settling his weight into a chair that had learned to hold men like him, "you're Eddard Stark's byblow." He lifted a hand when Jon inhaled. "Peace, lad. I don't say it to wound. I say it as a man says it's snowing when snow's falling. I've few enough Starks to bury. I don't mean to offend one of the few I have left above ground." Jon spread the obsidian on a white cloth. It was beautiful on the white. It looked like ink spilled on a snowblank page. He told his story again, and again the parts that mattered stood up and the parts that mattered less sat and waited to be asked. Wyman listened with the expression of a man who has grown rich by listening to men and then sending other men to do a thing. When Jon finished, Wyman's lips pursed. He touched one of the black blades with the fingertip of a man who had eaten so much bread, he no longer thought of it as precious. "I've been eating crow since the twins," he said mildly. "It tastes of ash. This tastes of something else. Necessity, perhaps, or common sense." He looked up and his eyes were not as soft as his belly suggested. "I'll feed you. I'll feed the free folk that come with you if you can fit them behind the walls I've built for my own. I'll send you back with flour and smoked fish and a broken ship if that will help you break someone else's. And I'll tell you this. If you bring me the head of a fry, I'll give you a barrel of oats and a barrel of wine for your trouble and won't ask where you got it." "We're not raiding," Jon said, and it cost him something to say so to a man whose daughter was buried because of the twins. "We're not cutting throats in the dark. We're making a thing that has not been before. It will take a different metal than that." Wyman's mouth quirked. "Good," he said at last. "If you'd asked me to knife a man in his bed, I'd have said yes while deciding which bed and which knife. This is harder. It will taste better." They moved then as winter moves, slow and inexorable and full of small sounds that add up to something bigger than noise. Jon went back to the Wolfswood and the long halls of men who called themselves lords as water calls itself river. He slept in more than one hall where the rugs had been pulled up and burned and the benches had been chopped to feed the fire, because that was what you did if you didn't want to freeze to death in your pride. He sat in the shadow of weirwoods and listened to old women talk about how the snow had been deeper when they were girls, and how the wolves had come down out of the hills and taken a man's hand when he put it out the door to see how cold it was. He spoke words that were his father's shape, and sometimes he thought he saw his father standing at the back of the hall with winter in his hair. The Boltons had sent men to collect what they called taxes and what the men on the far end of the exchange called extortion. Sometimes those men did not go home. Sometimes they went home with no hands because the Mormonts had reminded them how guest right worked. Ramsay Snow rode with dogs that made men hold their piss better than fear. Jon heard of him the way you hear thunder before you see the storm, and he felt the old rage stir. A rage that came with a quite awful clarity. Some men could not be reasoned with, only stopped. The stopping came at last in a white world under a gray sky when the wind had made the air itself into a knife. Ramsay came north with men in pink cloaks. Gods, even their color was a wound, and a smugness that crawled on his face. He had taken back Winterfell and set up his banners like someone had hung skins to dry. Theon Greyjoy, the boy who had once lived in Winterfell like a pet falcon and turned into a stoat, had been seen there in chains and worse. Jon thought of the words he might say to Theon one day and found the words he could say had all had their legs broken. He saved the anger for Ramsay. They met in the woods outside the broken walls, not because Jon had meant to give Ramsay the courtesy of a battle beyond his walls, but because Ramsay had come out, hungry for a hunt and certain it would be easy. Ramsay's hounds were big and beautiful and wrong. He sent them first. Ghost went low and white and silent. The hounds broke like water on rock, then snarled and came again. One took Ghost at the haunch and paid its price with its life. Ygritte's arrows took two in the throat and one in the eye that had been so proud a moment earlier. Ramsay laughed. Sounded like a boy throwing stones at a pond. Jon put his hand to Longclaw's grip and the sword woke under it. He did not remember drawing, not quite. He remembered moving and the men around him moving, the thens closing like a door, the spearwives stepping forward, Tormund's voice full of filth and joy, and above it all Ygritte's calm, low curse when a string caught her bracer. Ramsay danced with his sword, quick, pretty, and cruel. He liked to cut men and then watch them bleed while he told a story about a woman's cries in a hall. And Jon saw what he was and shrugged the story away like a coat that did not fit. When they came together, steel struck steel with the sound of two ideas colliding. Ramsay smiled, then frowned, then snarled. He did not like being matched by a bastard who did not sneer and who did not make the mistake of letting him talk. When Ramsay fainted low, Jon went low too, and then high, and saw the surprise on the other man's face as Longclaw's flat struck his temple. Ramsay reeled and his dog's teeth smile came back, forced now, and he did an ugly, desperate thing with his offhand and a dagger that no knight would own and every murderer would. Jon took the cut along his ribs and stepped in the way. He'd stepped into the wind on the wall when the gust would have blown him away. He bound Ramsay's dagger arm with his forearm and drove his knee into the man's thigh and heard the satisfying, stupid sound of pain. Ramsay snarled inarticulately, and then he went down on his knee, and then Ygritte's arrow sprouted from his shoulder just under the collarbone. And then Tormund's hand was on the man's hair, and then it was done. Jon did not cut his head off. He did not have to. Ramsay bled out with a fury that consumed only himself. They opened Winterfell's gates for the first time in too long to people who had not come to burn it. The great hall smelled like a hearth that had gone without good wood for a year too many, and the heart tree saw them with its carved eyes that had learned to see men do ugly and noble things in the same afternoon. The people came in ones and twos first, then tens and twenties, then like snow itself, inevitable. The free folk came, too, in lines that held near the door, not pushing, not swaggering, not taking and not begging. Ghost trotted through the foundry and sniffed at ashes and then lay in the courtyard as if he had been born there. Jon stood under the broken stone wolves and felt something crack that needed cracking. They did not call Jon Lord. He did not let them. He took the high seat only to give it to those who had borne the weight before him and would again. He called the mountain lords, the fisherwomen of Bear Island, the small men of the gift whose hands were raw from trying to keep fields too stony and weather too cruel, the Manderly envoys with fish pins and soft boots, the free folk chieftains who had names like Skur and Rag and Lark and names that were not names but sounds of places, and strange as it felt the hall did not burst with them. It held. "Winter is here," he said, and there was no poetry left in him for that. "The dead move. The wall is tall but not tall enough to keep the wind from blowing over it. I won't ask you to kneel to a man you don't own, and I won't ask free folk to kneel to men they do not recognize. I will ask this, that you hold guest right like a shield, and that you swear to stand when the dead come. I ask you to swear it here under these stones that do not lie, under that tree that does not forgive lies." Wool stepped forward and put his big hand on the hilt of his knife as a man will put his hand on the mane of a horse he means to ride. "I'm Wool," he said, for reluctant courtesy required a name even when everyone knew it. "I'll stand, and if the man beside me steals my bread, I'll cut his hand off and hold it out to the dead. That's guessed right." Lyanna Mormont, who should have been in a bed with a doll and instead had a haul in both hands, crossed the floor with her chin up so far she might have been taller than Tormund. "House Mormont has stood for Stark since the sea was fresh," she said. "If this man is half of Ned Stark and all of himself, we'll stand for him and with him. We won't kneel. We'll stand." Val, spear point in the floor, leaned, and her sharp face softened. "We don't kneel," she said. "Even our children don't kneel because their knees are all scabbed. But we know a thing worth bending for. We'll bend our heads to this. Guessed right and standing when the dark comes." Wyman's envoy, with his fish pin and shrewd eyes, nodded once as if to himself and once to the hall. "White Harbor stands," he said. "We'll bake bread that is better than this bread, and we'll wish for butter we do not have." It went like that, rough and determined, without music because the music was in the consent itself. The swearings were not graceful. They did not ripple like banners. They were more like a heap of firewood brought by men from scattered holdings and piled in a big messy pile, set aflame with tinder that anyone had, growing to a good warmth that was better for the unevenness. Ygritte watched with her arms folded and her head tilted and a smile that lifted one corner of her mouth and then the other. They put free folk in the empty crofts of the new gift and in winter huts in the Wolfswood that had not had laughter in a decade. They put Mormont daughters in the free folk camps to teach and to learn and to keep the sharp free folk honest by the even sharper fact of being watched by women who would call them bastards with affection and kill them without it. They put mountain men on wall walks that had been empty and told them they could spit on the wall as long as they mended it after, and they did. They put thens in fields and watched them teach kneelers how to stand in a line long enough to make even winter hesitate. There were quarrels. There was a woman whose sheep went missing and a free boy with a hungry look and a habit. John cut the boy's palm lightly, enough to bleed, and gave the sheep owner meat from his own stores, then set the boy to work with a baker who could keep both hands on his dough and a child on the same bench without mixing them. There was a then who laughed at a kneeler's god and a kneeler who answered with a southern oath and a fist. They both worked on the same section of wall for a week with the worst mortar, and by the end they laughed together when it caved and they had to start again. There was a mountain man who claimed a free woman with a hand on her arm as if she were a goat. Ygritte broke 3 of his fingers and made him thank her for leaving any thumb at all. John said nothing and Ygritte raised an eyebrow that said he'd said everything necessary by keeping silent. Samwell Tarly came, pink and rounder than a man who'd walked should be, holding a bundle like a man holds a bird too fragile to fly. He had Gilly at his side and a baby with eyes like an accusation held up to God. Sam told John in his stumbling plain way about a hidden gate under the night fort that opened its mouth if you said the old words and held them like you meant them, and John closed his eyes and laughed once and put his forehead in his hand. "I thought I had to climb everything I ever wanted," he said, "and there was a door." "We didn't know," Sam said, wounded as always by having failed to have known what a man could not have known. "We know now." Sam told them of books that spoke of winds and of black ice and of how dragonglass and fire were not the only answers. He spoke of Valyrian steel as if he'd swallowed ashes and gave a small cough as if one had lodged in his throat. He said the word Old Town the way a child says home who has not yet gone there. Jon squeezed his shoulder and thought of how many kinds of courage there were, and how many men we needed, each one his own kind. They sent men south to watch the Neck. They sent men to the east to watch Carhold. They sent a woman of the free folk to White Harbor with a handful of obsidian and a bundle of arrows and a mouth full of stubbornness to teach. And the arrow fletchers there muttered and felt the black stone and began to dream in black triangles. They sent boys to the kitchens because it is brave to carry stew through a hall full of men who think they are braver. They sent girls to the training yard because it is brave to learn to hold a spear when the boys laugh, and less brave when the girls laugh louder. Winter deepened. The air grew so sharp men bled from breathing and called it a chapped lip. The sky pressed low, gray on gray, until a day came cold enough to ring when struck, and white ravens came from the south like messengers that had remembered their errand at last. They dropped their news like white stones. Winter is here. Men who had said the words their whole lives without any more attachment to reality than calling a road felt something tear inside and recognized that old and useful thing. Fear acknowledged and placed where it can be watched. The others came on a night without wind. That was the first thing Jon noticed when he went up on the wall walk above the hunter's gate. There was no wind. The torches burned too steadily. The air made no noise. Ghost's hair lifted not because a breeze moved it, but because something else did. Ygritte came to stand by Jon, the hand where her bow rested almost tender. The first of the blue lights winked on out beyond the tree line, as if someone had raised a lantern and set it on the snow. Then another, and another. Then a sound that was not a horn and not a voice and not an animal made the stones under Jon's feet ring. He had always thought he would be frightened differently when it came. He had thought his bowels would loosen and he would shake and there would be a taste in his mouth like iron and promises broken. Instead, there was a deep, clean place in him where the water was very cold, and into that water he put the next steps he had to take. He called for the thens. He called for Tormund. He called for Wool and for Alysanne Mormont and for the man from the frozen shore who had laughed once in his life and was laughing now because he had found the moment that deserved it. He told the archers to wet their fletchings, for fire ate dry fletching too quickly, and to set their pots of pitch where falling would light the stuff rather than douse it. He told the boys who had brought wood to bring more. He told the girls to stay on the walls unless they were needed below. He told the men with obsidian to keep their pockets tight and their minds tighter. They came like the absence of warmth. The whites first, as the cheap courage a coward sends ahead. They moved with that terrible, dead patience. The first line met pitch and a rain of arrows and fell and wriggled implacably until the second line walked on them. The fire took and did not care. The then stepped forward when they had to step forward and stepped back when stepping back would save a man later in the battle. And Jon blessed them quietly in his head and promised himself to hate them another day for being so good at following and not leading if he needed the hate. Tormund roared and threw a man forward and caught him again by the belt to keep him from going too far and turned the momentum into a different direction like a man turning a sled. Ygritte's arrows went into eyes and mouths and made a winter of their own. The others came after, walking lightly. The snow did not bear the weight of their malice. It offered itself to them like a host. Jon saw one very close. His hair was white like old ice with air trapped in it. Its armor was the suggestion of armor, a thing that hurt the eyes to look at as if the air were harder there. It turned its head and its eyes were the blue of a cloudless sky in a season when that meant death. It lifted a sword that was a shard of everything painful that had ever been in winter. Came on. He met it with Longclaw and with a black dagger in his offhand and with Ygritte breathing beside him and Ghost low and silent behind. The first time the blades met, the sound made teeth ache 2 walls over. His wrist jarred. Longclaw did not break. He stepped and it was like they were dancing with death as the music. It struck and he felt the cold of it climb his arm and thought this is what dying of cold would be like if it happened all at once. Not pain, but the loss of feeling, and how can a man fight when he is forgetting his own arm? He answered with obsidian, a low, ugly thrust into the thing's flank when it leaned too far, and the sound it made was like the wind finding a hole in a hall and forcing itself through. It turned, and for a heartbeat he thought it would look at him, truly, as a man looks. Then Ygritte's arrow went into the place where a throat should have been, and the thing burst like a snowdrift struck wrong, and there was only wind where it had been, and the nearby whites went down as if their strings had been cut. They held. Gods helped them, they held. Dawn came slow and gray, as if ashamed to show its face to men who had had to make their own light. The dead retreated not in panic, because panic belonged to life, but in withdrawal, as if resetting a board. Jon watched them go with the terrible shaky knowledge that he would see them again, and they would not have forgotten the bit of him they had tasted. He turned and found Ygritte and put his forehead to hers. Her skin was cold and sweaty and alive. Ghost licked his hand and bit him lightly, as he had done when they were both young. When it was over, they counted losses and found them less than they had feared, but more than they could bear. They burned their dead, free and kneeled alike, and the smoke that rose was not the smoke of summer feasts or good bread or a hall filled with piss-taking songs. It was the smoke of the price men pay to wake up and still be men. Jon stood there and breathed it and let it tear the back of his throat, because that, too, was an oath. After, they met again in the hall under the stone wolves. Snow drifted through a hole in the roof and melted when it fell into the heat, and the smell was strange and clean and wrong. Jon turned his shoulders and the cut along his ribs tugged like a mild disapproval. Wyman manderly sent up bread that had butter on it. Jon ate it and did not cry. Ygritte ate hers half in bites and half in triumphant tears and laughed when the butter ran down her wrist and left a trail like a rope. "We'll have to go to Dragonstone," Sam said later, when he could talk without his teeth chattering from memory. "We'll need all of it. We'll need men who can nap it. We'll need men who can teach men who are too proud to learn from men they think less of." "We'll do it," Jon said. "We'll send men you pick and women you pick, and we'll send the owl girl and the fish boy and anyone else who can make another man into more than he is." "And you," Sam said, in that little brave way he had when he knew he would be slapped and hoped not to be, "you should send someone to the south to find the girl who remains. Sansa, Arya, I don't know which can be found. A Stark in Winterfell would pull the north around like a star draws frost." Jon looked at the stone wolves and thought of the way the Red Wedding had made his stomach turn, and of the way some men used names like ropes and some used them like bread. He thought of Sansa with her southern songs and Arya with her northern knives. He thought of Robb dead and Bran and Rickon lost to rumor and sadness. He thought of Ygritte wed to him under a weirwood, with leather biting into skin and laughter blunting fear. "I'll send men," he said. "I'll send men who know how to find a thing that doesn't want to be found and bring it home without breaking it. And if I can't find either girl this season, I'll keep this place for them so it doesn't rot to the ground. I'll keep it with stone and with bread and with the sort of stories men can live inside of." Ygritte put her hand on his and squeezed once. Hard. "You keep it," she said. "I'll keep you." The winter went on sharpening itself. They did not starve. They did not fall on each other like wolves. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they looked at a cup of ale and wept because it tasted like something they had thought they had lost. They trained men whose backs had bent over plows to hold lines that did not break when the dead hit them. They napped obsidian until a boy who had done it for a month could close his eyes in sleep and dream only of flakes and how they fell. They told stories around fires. Free folk stories of brave thieves and foxes that become women and women that become foxes, and kneeler stories of wolves that guard kings and kings who forget what the word means. The stories met and sniffed each other and sometimes fought and sometimes lay down together and made a new litter. When the next battle came, it did not surprise them. It was worse. The others had learned. They probed, they feinted, they sent the whites in patterns that forced Jon's men to choose which to save. They made men think their dead mothers were singing in the trees. They were patient as ice and twice as treacherous. But men had learned as well. The thens held. Wool and Burley and Nori came late and hard on a flank with a howl that reminded Jon that there are wolves under the skin of men. Mormont women fought on the walls and swore with artistry. Ygritte put arrows into eyes as if she were finally writing the letters of a language she had learned in bed. Ghost came back from a run with frost rimed on his fur and a shallow cut on his chest and the eyes of a creature old and certain. The black blades did their work. Men died less to terror and more to the plain truth that winter is bigger than any one man's courage. Between battles men lived. Jon went with Ygritte to the weirwood one morning when the snow had become a pulped thing underfoot. trampled, sordid, still beautiful from a distance. The face looked at him with that calm that had been on it when everything was different. Ygritte stood at his side in a cloak that had been a bear before it had been hers and held his hand not as if she needed to, but because she could. "I'm with child," she said into the quiet. It was like a bell being rung over his head very softly. He laughed, and it hurt, and he did not mind the hurt. He put a hand to her belly as if a man's hand could feel a thing so new. He thought of names, and all the names cried to be let in, and he told them to sit quiet for now and they would be fed later. He thought of the boy or girl with hair like smoke or rust, with eyes like his mother's if he had had a mother who was not a secret. He thought of stones being laid and bread being baked and people not starving and stories being told longer than a night. And in spite of the cut along his ribs and the blood under his nails and the dead he had put in the fire and the knowledge that more would come, he felt something he had not let himself feel since he had known what the dead were: gladness unadorned. He bent and pressed his forehead to the heart tree and did not ask for anything, because he had learned the old gods did not answer men who asked, only men who acted. And then afterward, when a man put his forehead to a tree and was quiet, sometimes something in him settled that needed settling. When he turned, Ygritte was looking at him like a challenge he would accept every day. He gripped her hand and said, "We'll make a place." "We are," she said. "We will." News came from the south in trickles that were thin and suspect. A king made of smoke and iron who had come to the wall of the world and then gone again to light a mountain and make a spectacle of law. A queen in the capital who drowned her enemies in wine and lies. A lion who had lost his hand but not his cunning. A boy king dead. It mattered and it did not. The cold was here. The others were here. The north was here. Stannis Baratheon did come. Once, with a cold look that had nothing to do with weather and a sword that burned as if to make men love it. He looked at Jon with disappointment for a vow broken and some slight respect for a vow kept to new people. He looked at Ygritte as if she were a tree with a knife, and Ygritte looked back as if he were a goat who had learned to bleat in 2 languages. Stannis offered Jon Winterfell for a price Jon would not pay. Jon offered him bread and honest counsel. They parted not enemies. The long winter did not become short because men had become wiser. It did not because men had become braver. It went on being itself. But the people inside it changed. The free folk and the North learned a way to call each other kin when there had been only names before. They learned to knock before entering the same hall. They learned to trade winterbark tea for barley bread and knives for stories. A Mormont girl married a free boy who had learned to say please without laughing. A then taught a Norei to stand 1 step longer in the line. A kneeler taught a spear wife to stitch without wasting thread and to swear in 3 new ways that made her pop with joy. Jon stood one evening on Winterfell's battered wall and watched a line of torchlight move across the snow. A caravan of men and women coming in from the outvillages with grain and with news and with a song about a fox who stole a hound's bone and led the hound to a better bone. The stars were sharp. The moon had learned to be thin from hunger and was now learning again how to eat. Ygritte's hand rested on her belly in a way that had become its own language. Ghost lay with his muzzle on his paws and his ears pricked. "You did this," Ygritte said quietly. "We did this," Jon said. He gestured with his chin to the moving line. "They did this." Ygritte snorted. "Aye, but they needed a fool to say the first foolish thing that turned out not to be foolish at all." He smiled, and the expression felt rusty because it had not been used for laughing and had been used for grimness. He let it be what it was. He listened to the sound the torches made when they moved in the cold, and he thought, "I thought the wall was the only way. I thought the only stories I could live in were ones where I climbed and where I bled and where I made myself smaller to be honorable. But there are other stories. There is one where I took a girl's hand and we tied a piece of leather around our wrists and we made a world. In the heart of the keep, under the shadow of the broken tower where a boy had once fallen and not died, men and women were baking bread. The smell lifted and spread like a rumor that made men hope. Jon took that into himself like air. He put his arm around Ygritte and she leaned into him as if leaning were a choice and a gift. The wind did not howl that night. It whispered. Far to the north something moved. There would be more battles. There would be days when the bread did not rise. There would be a child gnawing on a bone that had too little meat. There would be a man with frostbitten fingers who wept when he could no longer hold a spear and then learned to hold a hammer. There would be a woman who had thought herself only a set of sharp words who discovered she was a home. There would be a boy with eyes like a wolf's who stood on a wall and saw blue lights and did not piss himself. There would be a girl with a braid who shot an arrow that mattered. But there would be this as well. A hall where guest right meant something even to those who had not learned it from a maester. A field where a free boy and a kneeler girl dug peat out of the snow with hands the color of the same dirt. A long bench where a then sat at an end and a manderly at the other end, and they ate the same stew and did not sneer. And a room where a man and his wife lay and warmed one another against a winter that had forgotten how to end and remembered after all. In the quiet that came and went like a cautious guest, John thought of his father and of his mother, who was more rumor than woman, and he wondered if either could have guessed this. He thought of Rob and Caitlin, and he placed them carefully in the room in his head where grief lived and was fed and not allowed to run the house. He thought of Sansa with her songs and of Arya with her hard little knife, and he prayed, in the way of a man who does not ask, that one day a slim figure would come walking up the snowy road with her hood down because the wind would know her nose from a league off. "You know nothing," Ygritte murmured, because she could not help but say it sometimes when he looked at the sky like that. John said, "Not enough, not yet." He pressed his mouth to her hair and spoke the words he could see, plain and spare as winter trees. "I know this, we stand together. And when the dead come, we will not be strangers." Below them the torches made a slow river. The night held its breath. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled. Another answered. Another after that. Men smiled without meaning to. Women drew their cloaks tighter and stood a little taller. A child woke and put his hand to his chest as if to find the beat of his own heart, and fell back asleep with it measured under his palm. The snow hissed like a secret not any longer needing to be kept. When morning came, it came thin and gray, because winter's mornings were not much for display. Came anyway. John went down into it with Ygritte beside him and Ghost at his heel, and when men saw him they lifted their hands, not to kneel and not to take, but to greet. He lifted his hand and greeted back. He had no crown. He had no cloak a man could not buy with wool and dye. He had only his father's face and his own stubbornness and the piece of leather around his wrist. It was enough. The days made themselves one by one with a will that outlasted men. They filled them with bread and blood and quiet and laughter. They put their dead in the fire and their children in the world. The wall stood. The wind learned again how to have a voice. The dead came and were met. The living slept and woke and tried again. This is not a story that ends, John thought once, with the tired fondness of a man listing his chores. This is a thing we've decided to keep alive, like a fire. He fed it. He watched others feed it. He closed his eyes sometimes because the smoke stung. He opened them because the light was too good to miss. And there were nights when the hall thinned and the talk quieted and the flutes put away their tired songs. When Ygritte slept with one hand on her belly and Ghost twitched chasing dream elk. When John went up alone to the broken battlements and looked north and felt the cold like an old difficult friend and thought, "Father, if you can see, I chose my words. Mother, if you can hear, I chose my love. The free folk and the north will be kin before it's over. We've begun. We're not done." The stars were knives. The snow was ash. The world breathed. He breathed with it. He felt the weight of his sword against his leg and the weight of the leather on his wrist and the weight of the baby he had not yet touched and the weight of the eyes of men who had chosen to stand because he had asked them to. He felt them all, and he did not put any of them down. He stood there until the night turned over and the east began to edge in the faintest suggestion of less dark, until the wind, having gone away to sulk, returned with its old complaint and its old counsel. He stood until his nose burned and his fingers hurt, and the old gods, who hadn't said a word, said nothing in a way that let him know they had heard him anyway. Then he went down and found Ygritte stirring, and when she saw his face she did not ask what the sky had said. She put her hand on his chest and he put his on hers, and with that small good weight they made a promise again without wasting a single word.